Hello YouTubers and welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha and I've mentioned it before, but this is my birthday week this week. So these are going to be a series for myself. I'm going to do 3 videos looking at my favourite film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. So I'll start off with part 1 today. Like I say, it's been my favourite film since I was 8 years old. I think it was shown on Christmas Day on BBC One in 1988, which is when I would have first seen it. Didn't see it at the cinema. Saw part 2 and part 3 at the cinema. Part 2 would have come out the following year, and I was so excited to go and watch it, because I think by that point I'd probably, because I'd recorded it off the TV, and I'd probably watched it every day leading up to it. So over a 12-month period, I've probably watched the film maybe not 300 times, but it certainly felt like that. I think I've seen this film probably 200 times maybe in over the past 30 years now. And as I said in my top 10 movies list, when I put this at number 1, this film really could never not be my number 1. It's always there as a constant mainstay in my life, and other films I've kind of edged up the list and over time. And when I was in my late teens, I went about saying that A Clockwork Orange was my favourite film, because that was a more adult film, and I wanted to be a bit punkier, a bit more anarchic at the time, so a bit edgier. So I put A Clockwork Orange up there, and then after that I saw Oh Lucky Man, and I decided no, I wanted to get into smart, intelligent films, so I put Oh Lucky Man as my number 1. But really knowing in my heart of hearts that for a piece of popcorn entertainment, which is what Back to the Future is, that was really the one I loved, the one that was in my heart right from an early age. And I think Back to the Future 1's always going to be my favourite film. This is another one that everyone's seen, like Star Wars. I don't really need to go into too much detail of the plot. Everyone knows it. Marty McFly, 80s teenager, typical 80s teenager, he's 17 in the film, but he's played by the 24-year-old Michael J. Fox, the ever-youthful Michael J. Fox. He's your typical 80s teenager. He's got sort of aspirational, underachieving parents. He's a skateboarder. He hangs around with the town eccentric Doc Brown, who's the mad inventor, who invents a time machine, and he puts the inner workings of the time machine in a dilapidated DeLorean. This was kind of a very funny joke in 1985 when the film came out, because I think the DeLorean car had gone under a year before, because John DeLorean, the owner of and the designer of the DeLorean, he'd been caught by the FBI in a sting operation buying cocaine, and ended up going to prison. So the reason behind the DeLorean is it was primarily a joke at the time, but there was also great practical reasons for having the time machine be a car, because the original concept was that the time machine was going to be a refrigerator that the inhabitant would climb into and get zapped back into the past. They later rethought the concept and decided to go for a car instead. The reason being that it would have far greater story possibilities if the time machine was mobile. So they jettisoned the refrigerator idea, which would have been fun. It would have had a sort of steampunk aesthetic to it, and I think there is a kind of steampunk sort of Jules Verne inspired aesthetic to these films, especially in the third film. So they made it the DeLorean, which is one of the coolest looking cars. I mean, when it came out in the 80s, it was it looked like a futuristic car. In the film, it's mistaken for a flying saucer at one point because it's so futuristic looking. It's chrome steel. The doors go up. It was one of the first cars where the doors went up rather than sideways, and this was seen as the way of the future in the 80s. The 80s were quite a futuristic decade, I think, especially if you look at the science fiction and the fantasy movies that were being created then. And so, everything was about products that were futuristic looking, that looked like they could have come from the 21st century, or what our idea at the time of the 21st century was going to be. And so the DeLorean car represents that. It's the ideal choice, really, from an aesthetic standpoint.
Einstein! Hey, Einstein, where's the dot, boy? Huh?
Through a series of events, because in the film the time machine is powered by plutonium, and Doc Brown rips the plutonium off from some Libyan terrorists, and on the night that he initially tests the time machine with Marty's help to see if it works, some Libyan terrorists actually turn up and murder Doc Brown. For a film that is essentially a kids movie, it was very popular with kids, or a family movie, it does start with one of the main protagonists getting murdered by terrorists. Obviously, like Libyan terrorists and Middle Eastern terrorists were a sort of fringe thing at the time. They hadn't really taken off as a kind of global threat that we should be worried about in the West. So using them as a plot device didn't seem as politically charged as it would do now if you had that as a plot device. For a film that is essentially a kind of sweet, good-natured comedy, it starts with an act of brutal terrorism. So Marty, to escape, he gets in the time machine, flees from the terrorists, and ends up hitting 88 miles an hour, which is the point at which the flux capacitor, the time circuits kick in, and he gets zapped back 30 years to the 1950s. So the rest of the film is, I guess, a big sort of nostalgia fest for the 1950s. I think 1950s nostalgia in the 80s was as big as what 80s nostalgia really is now amongst cinema goers and TV viewers, with things like Stranger Things and Ready Player One. Back in the 80s, it was things like Grease, American Graffiti, Happy Days, and Back to the Future, which is the sci-fi take on 50s nostalgia. And there's great fun to have with 50s nostalgia, with greases and leather jackets and A More Innocent Time, I Like Ike, and how political attitudes have changed over time. So the main thrust of the plot, once Marty is back in the 50s and he's hooked up with the 50s counterpart to Doc Brown, played brilliantly by Christopher Lloyd. The original choice for Doc Brown, incidentally, was John Lithgow, and John Lithgow is actually one of my favourite actors. So it's funny, as much as I love Christopher Lloyd and in the role, he is Doc Brown for me. I think John Lithgow would have been a great choice for Doc Brown. He'd have done the eccentric madcap shtick very, very well. One of the most difficult things to do, I think, in films is do convincing aging makeup. It's still not something that's really been truly perfected even now. Now it's kind of done with CGI, if you watch the Marvel movies and things like that. But even then, it's when you're dealing with anything involving the human face, you have to be very careful because the slightest giveaway highlights the fakery. And when you're dealing with the human face, anything fake about the human face, like having a 30-year-old actor or a 40-year-old actor playing a 60 or 70-year-old, if it's not done very, very well, the fakery can look very odd and upsetting in a way. I think it's a testament actually to Back to the Future that with the aging makeup on the actors, they went for a minimal approach with it, and instead they tried to imply aging more through performance rather than through really good prosthetic makeups, and I think that was a wise choice. Some of the actors pull it off better than others. Leah Thompson, even though she was sort of the same age as Michael J. Fox when she made the film, she's quite convincing in the early part of the film as a woman pushing 50 with a drink problem. Whereas it seems like Christopher Lloyd, for example, I was always slightly confused why there didn't seem to be that much difference between the 1950s Doc and the 1980s Doc. It seemed like he hadn't really aged at all. The same goes for James Tolkien, who plays Strickland, the principal of the school. I mean, there is a joke that I've always really liked, where he sees him back in the 50s and he says, "Jesus, didn't that guy ever have hair? He was still bald 30 years ago." Yeah, bald and unaged. His performance as the 1950s principal doesn't seem to have changed. It doesn't seem to be any different. He still plays it with exactly the same energy. Yeah, so as I was saying, the main thrust of the plot is Marty gets in the way of his parents meeting, and as a consequence he realises he's going to get erased from history because his parents never meet, they never fall in love, and he will never get born. And so the main thrust is trying to get his parents together because he's there where at the point where his mum would have met his dad, his mum falls for him instead. So that's the there's two really odd elements to this film. It's the terrorism subplot and the murder that happens, or sorry, supposed murder that happens early on in the film. Although, well, you could argue that because the 1985 that Marty gets back to at the end is an alternate 1985, that the Doc at the start of the film is flat out murdered. That's debatable. So you get that odd subplot, and you also, the other odd subplot is this Oedipal thing that goes on with Leah Thompson, Lorraine, Marty's mum, essentially falling in love with her own son. And the writers Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, they were unsure how to get out of this subplot, and of course they came up with a logical solution, which is towards the end of the film, his mum kisses Marty and then she says it's like kissing her brother, which it would be. We contain within us a sort of chemical in our saliva that doesn't chime with those of our siblings or our parents. That's how we avoid incest for the most part in society. The film is replete with great performances. Famously, Michael J. Fox replaced Eric Stoltz. They actually took the unusual step because they were like 3 weeks into filming with Eric Stoltz, but Eric Stoltz was giving a very dramatic performance in the film and they thought it wasn't working, so they replaced him 3 weeks into the shoot with Michael J. Fox, who had to shoot all his scenes at night essentially because he was busy making his sitcom Family Ties during the day. And so he was sort of operating on 2 or 3 hours sleep throughout the entire shoot. And you can kind of see it. here and there. Although he's a young man with a lot of energy, he looks a little, knowing that, he does look a little drained and tired in some scenes. You couldn't imagine anybody else other than Michael J. Fox in this role. Thomas F. Wilson, who plays Biff, of course, he's absolutely hysterical. I mean, he wasn't really the villain of the film. He sort of became the villain of the trilogy overall when they brought him back for the sequels. But in the first film, he's really just kind of a supporting player, a kind of a character who just shows up to create a bit of conflict and tension in the latter part of the film. He's absolutely hilarious in the film. You can't go wrong with the really dumb character. When you have a villain who's a bit of an arsehole, I mean, that's one thing, but an arsehole who's just really, really stupid, which is what Biff is, it can lead to great comic potential and possibilities. He has the lines like, "Why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?" And that becomes a constant running joke in the trilogy, him constantly getting these clever phrases wrong.
How much money you got on you?
Well, how much you want, Biff?
All right, punk. Now I'm gonna...
Whoa, Biff. What's that? Whoa, kid, stop.
Hey!
Boy. I'll get it back to you, all right?
Wow, look at him go!
I think my favourite performance in the film has to be Crispin Glover. He plays Marty's dad, who's this very gawky, awkward, wannabe science fiction writer. And it's somebody who's essentially playing someone who's supposed to be into science fiction and is a bit of a nerd. I mean, he's kind of perfect, Crispin Glover. He gives a very bizarre performance. He plays a nerd really well. And, you know, just things like his laugh early on, where he's watching, I think, The Honeymooners on TV, and you just hear, you know, you think, yeah, we've all met somebody like that. Somebody really sort of, you have to think, is this guy for real? He almost seems too abstract. But a hilarious performance from Crispin Glover. He's a sort of bit part player, character actor who, I mean, he's worked steadily for the past 30 years. His dad was Mr. Wint in Diamonds Are Forever. But he almost seems too intelligent for Hollywood. He's a very, very clever guy, but a very, very eccentric guy as well. I mean, God, you see him now, he's one of the characters that kind of looks unchanged over time.
Give me a hand, Reginald. Ow! Damn it, man, I sliced my hand. Whose are these? Mine. Thanks a lot.
You're gonna break his arm! Biff! Leave him alone! Let him go! Let him go!
Are you okay?
Ni- 1988 for me was really the year that cemented cinema as being my passion in life, and I put that down to two things. The first live action film I ever saw at the cinema, I saw this year. I think it was on my birthday. I went to see a re-release of E.T. And the thing about E.T. is It's a fantastic film. Maybe not one of my favourites, but it is a really, really good film. I didn't think that it was possible to be moved by a film as much as when I first saw E.T. I remember, I didn't cry at the film, but I remember in the final scene of the film feeling like I was going to cry, and not really realising that cinema could do that to you. And I think that's something I've been looking for ever since, really, with films, is to find stuff that can move me emotionally. Maybe not necessarily make me cry. If a film can instill an emotional reaction in you, be it anything, be it dread, laughter, unease, elation. Like I say, I saw E.T. on my birthday, and then fast forward 8 months to Christmas, and I saw Back to the Future, the film that would become my favourite film of all time. And I often have to question myself with Back to the Future, which came first. It's like a chicken and an egg thing. And what I mean by that is everything I think I like or really love in other works is there in Back to the Future. And I really don't know if it's my love and my repeated viewing of Back to the Future that instilled those elements in me as my favourites, or whether they were there already, just waiting to hatch, and Back to the Future just seemed like the perfect movie for me. For example, it's kind of a science fiction film. Science fiction is probably my favourite genre. It's a time travel movie. I love time travel movies. Everything from Bill and Ted, The Time Machine, and in particular, maybe not necessarily films where characters get zapped back into the past, into historical settings, but time paradox stories are a big favourite of mine. So that's there in Back to the Future. It's a comedy as well. Again, I love to laugh. It's got really well defined characters. Again, in other stuff, you know, if a film or a TV show's got really well-defined characters, I'm going to relate to it a lot better than something that's got slightly more ill-defined characters. It's got one of the best scripts of a Hollywood movie ever written. So good that for the past 30 years, it's been taught in screenwriting classes as the perfect way to structure a film, as well as the story elements and the three-act structure and everything building to itself. If you watch the first act of the film, say, every scene is essentially essentially has a setup to something that will pay off later on. So, even like a simple scene like Marty talking to his girlfriend Jennifer and lamenting the fact that his band doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and then they go to kiss, and then they're interrupted by the woman who's collecting money to have the clock tower restored. She gives him a flyer, and Jennifer writes her number on the back before she goes. Seems like a very simple scene, but right there, I mean, you have the setup for Marty's motivation in the film. He's lamenting the fact that he doesn't think his band's going anywhere, which kind of gets resolved later on when he gets to perform live on stage, the Johnny B. Good number. His sort of frustration that his old man has instilled sort of negativity in him, that gets resolved later on when he convinces he discovers that his old man had aspirations to be a science fiction writer, something that he never suspected in him before, that the old man could do anything creative. And this leads Marty to convincing his old man to pursue his dreams, so that when he gets back at the end of this film, he's rewritten history and his dad's now a successful science fiction writer. You have the establishment that the clock tower's been struck by lightning and doesn't work anymore. So there you have the story element that you need, that Marty knows when the lightning's going to strike, so he so that Doc can harness the power of the lightning to power the time machine to get Marty home. And you also have Marty's other motivation for coming home, which is, as well as he wanted to get back to his parents, his love for his girlfriend. There you can see, although it looks a simple story, that there's real thought gone into just the mechanics of the storytelling. And as I say, that's an element to this day that whenever I see anything else where they really put in the footwork, the groundwork where it counts, which is in the scripting stages of the film, that's something I really respond to now.
1.21 gigawatts! 1.21 gigawatts! Great Scott! What the hell is a gigawatt? Look, all we need is a little plutonium.
Oh, I'm sure that in 1985, plutonium was available in every corner drugstore, but in 1955, it's a little hard to come by. Marty, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid you're stuck here.
Whoa, Doc, stuck here? I can't be stuck here. I got a life in 1985. I got a girl.
Is she pretty?
Doc, she's beautiful. She's crazy about me. Look at this. Look what you wrote here, Doc. I mean, that says it all.
Marty, I'm sorry, but the only power source capable of generating 1.21 gigawatts of electricity is a bolt of lightning.
What did you say?
A bolt of lightning. Unfortunately, you never know when or where it's ever going to strike.
We do now.
This is it. This is the answer. It says here that a bolt of lightning is going to strike the clock tower precisely 10:04 p.m. next Saturday night. If we could somehow harness this lightning, channel it into the flux capacitor, it just might work. Next Saturday night, we're sending you back to the future.
I hope you can see there why I love this film so much, as well as it just chiming on a lot of levels and having lots and lots of elements that I like. I do think it's a great movie in and of itself. It really works. It's popcorn cinema, but popcorn cinema at its best, and it's long been my favourite. So yeah, love film, collected merchandise for years. In 1993, I went on holiday to California, and we went to Universal Studios, and the most exciting part, well, the two most exciting, no, there was three really exciting elements to my Universal Studios tour. It was all exciting, but the three most exciting parts was getting to go on the Back to the Future ride, which apparently doesn't exist anymore. It's a real shame because it was a great ride. You stood in line for an hour to get in, but you were never bored because they played in video footage of Christopher Lloyd as Doc, and you get the story that Biff has nicked the time machine so that when you get onto the ride, you have to chase Biff through time. So the time machines are all flying. You look around, there's DeLoreans all around with other people's on the ride, and the ride itself is just a big IMAX screen, but you're flying over the futuristic hill valley. You get zapped back in time. You go into the mouth of a dinosaur at one point, and the DeLorean's shuddering and all sorts. It was so much fun. So there was that, but the big kudos for me was seeing the original DeLorean. There was like a whole dilapidated car section where they just left props from the films, and there was the DeLorean next to the Blues Brothers car. But the big kudos was going to the Hill Valley set, because the Hill Valley town centre is a big set. You can see crop up in other things as well. I watched the first ever episode of The Twilight Zone. That's all set on the same set, and I didn't even realise watching it, but I thought, that's the Hill Valley set. That is definitely the Hill Valley set. I recognise it, and I think it's used in Gremlins as well. That was an enormously fun thing to do. Of course, it's missing the set dressing now, which I didn't realise at the time. I thought I'd go in and it would look like the 1950s, but it's very, very plain as you go in. A couple of years ago, we did a thing called, well, we didn't do a thing, we went to a thing called the Secret Cinema. The Secret Cinema essentially plays famous movies for the past, but makes it a big event, so they construct a set. I think they've done The Empire Strikes Back, and they constructed a set. They basically made a huge Hill Valley set, and you got to go and watch the film on the clock tower face. And then, as the film plays, they have actors coming out, and so you have the DeLorean going over the place, and it exploded, and the fire trails go off, and you have Doc and Marty appearing here and there, and Biff. So we're in the middle of the skateboard scene. They actually performed the skateboard scene live in front of us as the movie was playing. And then towards the end of the film, as Doc zips down the zip wire, myself and Little Buddha, who were very drunk at this point, I have to say, we actually got him to position because we knew this moment was coming. And as the stuntman came down the zip wire, by this point we were two 7-year-old kids again. As he came down the zip wire, we just stood at the bottom going, yeah! So I guess that's the hook of Back to the Future for me, is it takes me back to my childhood. I put it on and I'm 8 years old again on a Christmas day, falling in love with movies all over again. So there you have it, folks. Finally, I've been planning to do this one for a while, and I finally got it out of my system. I don't care if nobody watches this video, quite frankly, because, like I say, this one's for me. Back to the Future, my favourite movie. So, it's Christmas 1989. I go with my whole family to the cinema to watch Back to the Future Part 2. Convinced I'm not going to get in, actually. I think the last film I went to see at the cinema was Masters of the Universe, which was sold out. I think the one and only time I've ever actually been to the cinema and not been able to get in because of a packed house. It just does not happen anymore. Later caught Masters of the Universe on TV when it was broadcast. I think that's the one and only time I've ever seen that film. So maybe my movie taste would be much different now if I had got into Masters of the Universe. I think I ended up seeing The Rescuers Down Under instead or something, or the original Rescuers. But anyway, got into Back to the Future Part 2. So excited to get in. And what a strange, bizarre, informative, fun, enjoyable, and slightly frustrating experience it was. Back to the Future Part 2. The tradition in 80s cinemas was, if a film was a success, to do a sequel, but the sequels were always sort of rehashes of the original. They always just kind of, in many cases, lifted the plot wholesale from the first film. An example purely at random would be Home Alone 2, which, although it shifts the setting from a home to the Big Apple, to all intents and purposes it's the same film. It copies the same beats, beat for beat, throughout. So Back to the Future Part 2 really, it isn't in that tradition. I think that the big key to the type of sequel is the word part in the title. This isn't another instalment of the same episodic franchise. This is a continuation of the original story. Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale actually said that they never intended to do a sequel, which seems odd, as the final scene of the film seems the most sequel baity thing you could possibly imagine. But they said they never intended for that to be a setup for a sequel, for two reasons. One, they didn't actually want to do a film set in the future because predictions of the future are never right. Even Stanley Kubrick didn't get his predictions of the future right. In the same way that Star Trek kind of happened to get some guesses right, for the most part it's woefully inaccurate. So they had no, if they were ever going to do any more, they had no intention of there being of doing a film set in the future. The other thing was that they said if that was going to be the setup for a sequel, they never would have put Jennifer, the girlfriend, in the car, because that was really a story hindrance for them when it came to writing the sequel and taking the joke ending of the first film as a launching pad for the story, which is why Jennifer as a character is kind of sidelined very early on in the story, but does play in a little bit here and there throughout part 2 and part 3. When it was decided that when they do the sequel, they decided to take a few novel approaches towards it. I think the launching pad to do the sequel was maybe the Star Wars films and the Indiana Jones films. So they knew that part 2 was going to be the dark middle act in a trilogy. And then springboarding from that, they thought, well, okay, if we're going to do part 2, we're probably going to end up doing part 3. Why not just do both parts together, film them back to back? This was revolutionary step number 2 when it came to doing sequels in the case of this film. The third revolutionary step that they took, and this really also plays into the fact that they used the part 2 moniker, is they thought, well, what's Empire Strikes Back aside, what's generally considered to be the best sequel of all time? The Godfather Part 2. And that's why this is another reason why Back to the Future Part 2 has the part moniker in it. It's kind of an homage to that, because that also informed the fact that they could do something a little bit fun, a little bit different with a sequel, rather than just repeating the beats of the first film in a different timeline, which I mean arguably Part 3 does as well. It repeats the beats of the first film, but they kind of saved it over for that, and part 2 was really all set up for that. But they took the novel approach of, once they'd had a bit of fun in the future, which is only really the first 20-25 minutes tops of the film, and the dark middle act of the film. They then went back to the 1955 setting at the exact same time as the first film is happening. And so, like The Godfather Part 2, it's not a sequel and a prequel all in one movie. It's something I don't think that's really been done before or since, which is a sequel and I guess an equal, you'd call it. It's a movie that takes place in tandem with the first film. I've heard it, Back to the Future Part 2 described as Godardian. It's almost a dissection of what the sequel could be by re-evaluating the first film and putting new elements in there. So having been hampered with the character of Jennifer, recast in this film with Elizabeth Shue, and the fact that they were tied into the sequel setting, they thought, well, the futuristic setting of 2015. The filmmakers thought, well, what can we do that's novel? How do we represent the future? Because no one ever predicts the future right. Well, let's not even try to predict the future right. So the future section of the film is not meant to be taken at face value. It's largely jokes. It's sort of the Futurama approach to predicting the future. It's more, oh, wouldn't it be funny if this happened, rather than we think this is going to happen. A lot of people say, oh, it never got the predictions right. We're not all scooting about on hoverboards now. They never thought we were going to be scooting about on hoverboards. They just wanted to recreate the skateboard sequence from the first film, and thought the Jetsons' view of the future is that we're all going to be flying around. So obviously the logical way to do that sequence in a 2015 setting is to have a skateboard that flies. It wasn't meant to be a prediction of the future. It was just a funny little idea. As are all the predictions in the futuristic setting, they never really thought that all lawyers would be abolished. They never really thought that everyone would have a small nuclear fusion compactor on the front of their car. These are jokes, and that was their approach to the film. And I'd have to say, if there's one thing that they did get right, it's probably the nostalgia thing. I could easily imagine something like the Cafe 80s existing now. Maybe not with computers for waiters, but an 80s nostalgia cafe with arcade games and pictures of Ronald Reagan and Michael Jackson all over. It is something I could imagine existing now. Antique shops filled with Dustbusters, Apple Macs, an old Roger Rabbit doll. That's something I could imagine. Looking at the way that store's depicted in the film, that's something I could very much imagine existing now. So some things they got right. I remember going into this film, seeing it in the cinema cold, not really knowing anything about it, assuming, as I'd done ever since I saw the first film, that the second film would be entirely set in the future. It's funny when you watch the film that when they leave the futuristic setting, the 2015 setting, it's very abrupt. It's almost has one line, "Oh, we need to get back to the present, get back to the past," and the next scene they're there, and it's like, oh, okay, 25-minute film. I thought it would be longer than that. And then we get into I'd say arguably the least, for me personally, it's the least successful portion. Like in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you probably you get on shaky ground when you create a franchise that's supposed to be fun and light entertainment, and then you try and do the dank, depressing middle act. And so the middle act of the middle act, the middle act of the Temple of Doom is incredibly dark, and the middle act of this film is pretty dark. I remember being quite upset at the notion of Marty getting back into his bedroom and finding out that his family weren't there anymore, and there's this other family living there. There's a screaming girl in the bed because she thinks she's been attacked, and then the dad comes in with a baseball bat and tries to club his head in. And there's nothing like that in the first film. This was quite worrying and upsetting for me. It was a very confusing 20-minute section of the film. Quite interesting when you establish that Biff's essentially taken over Hill Valley with the winnings that he's made from his gambling, because the older Biff has given him the book to give him all the gambling predictions for the next 50 years. And let's say this was never meant to be a Donald Trump. The fact that he looks a little bit like Donald Trump is purely coincidental. This was never meant to be a prediction of the future, because I think you'll notice in the film it's never actually established that Biff is president. He's just a very rich man. It takes on a darker hue, a darker tone than anything that happened in the first film. But what saves it slightly or redeems it slightly, once you establish that George McFly is dead, and in this reality the Doc has been committed because he's insane. You wonder why. What's the story there? Lorraine, Marty's mum, is now married to Biff. Well, once it's been established that they're now in an alternate 1985, an alternate timeline, then I remember getting slightly more back on track with the film and thinking, okay, well that's an interesting idea. So where do they go from here? And of course, the notion of going back to 1955 and having the rest of the story take place in tandem with the first film is the saving grace of this film. It was the revolutionary idea that hasn't really been done before us since in film, and is easily the most fun section of the film. You think the futuristic setting is going to be the most fun section. It wasn't the original idea. The original idea with the sequel was that they were going to do the 60s, funnily enough. The original idea was that the final act of the film was going to take place in 1968, be the hippie movement, the civil rights movement going on, and Lorraine would be very politicised. And I think the Crispin Glover turning down the sequels maybe played into that, because I think maybe he was going to play more into that if that was going to be the story. That was going to be the third act of the film, and then they had a rethink and thought, actually, this might be a fun idea to go back into the first film. And it is a fun idea because, like I say, it takes on an almost Jean-Luc Godard approach to the material, and you have, Marty running into himself or hiding from himself, and you have scenes from the first film, scenes I was very, very familiar with at this time, so I was able to see what they got right and what they got wrong. So you have scenes from the first film taking place over Marty's shoulder as he's cowering behind cars.
Beginning to sound just like my mother.
Yeah, right.
When I have kids, I'm gonna let them do anything they want. anything at all.
Yeah, I'd like to have that in writing. Yeah, me too.
Marty, why are you so nervous?
So some of the scenes in the first film playing into the events that happen in the second film. So when Marty leaves, when Marty runs through the door after saying goodbye to his parents, it's just an innocuous moment in the first film, but it takes on a new significance when you rewatch it, because you realise that's the point, that he gets smacked in the face and Biff steals the book back. Yeah, Back to the Future Part 2. Here's my take on it. I love all three sections of the trilogy, and I do get the argument, because some people hold this up as, of the two sequels, as being their favourite. Some people even hold it up as being the best of the trilogy, and I get both those arguments. But for me personally, when it comes to personal enjoyment, for me personally, it's the least successful entry in the series. There are slight problems here and there. There's tonal shifts here and there that are a little jarring, and the filmmakers will often say that the middle section is the most difficult portion of a trilogy to pull off. So I can't blame Robert Zemeckis and co-screenwriter Bob Gale entirely, because they had a hard task to mount. The middle section of a film, you're essentially trying to tell a coherent narrative with a beginning, middle and an end, but you don't have a beginning or an end. The tonal shifts do sort of detract a little from my enjoyment of the film, but that's not to say that there isn't much to enjoy in the film. The futuristic setting is a lot of fun. The use of split screen is a lot of fun, having three Michael J. Foxes play off himself, playing his own son and his own daughter as well. I don't know why Elizabeth Shue couldn't have played the daughter, but there you go.
Al, I'm just worried about Jennifer. Why isn't she home yet?
I'm not sure where Jennifer is, Mom. Should have been home hours ago, but I'm having a hard time keeping track of these days.
Fruit,
She's one of those moods I have.
Thank you. Aren't you and Jennifer getting along?
Oh, yeah, great, Mom. We're like a couple of teenagers, you know? Dad, telephone, it's Needles.
Dad, it's for you.
The aging makeup isn't quite as good in this one. Like I said, when in the first film they went for the subtle approach. Here they went for a more latexed approach, and it looks far more plasticky in this film than it does in the first, unfortunately. But there you go. If there's a redeeming feature of part 2, it is the final act, the 1955 Redux section, which is just packed full of fun and imagination, having the set pieces in the film be reimagined versions of what was going on, or what was really going on in the first film, but from a different point of view. It really makes this film something unique, and as I've said before, something that's hadn't been tried in a sequel before and hasn't really been tried since. So there you go, folks. That's just a few thoughts on Back to the Future Part 2. I've just literally about 20 minutes ago finished watching the third film and just had a bit of a refresher, a bit of a reacquaintance with it. It's not that I really needed it. It's a film I've seen many, many times. The trilogy as a whole is really something that's a little unusual in movie trilogies in its structure, in its setup. I can't think of many other movie trilogies that really sort of played with its own setup, its own rules, its own world than the Back to the Future trilogy. That was maybe partly inspired by the fact that the first installment was never meant to be the opening chapter of a trilogy in the same way that Star Wars was apparently meant to be an opener to a trilogy, although I dispute that. I think that maybe Empire and Return of the Jedi were afterthoughts, extemporizations on that world. It's not the opener to a trilogy in the same way that The Fellowship of the Ring is meant to be the opener to a trilogy. That film was made very much with the knowledge that there would be a part 2 and part 3 because they filmed all 3 films back to back. So what makes the Back to the Future films unique is with part 2 and part 3. I think that's the only example where you get... Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say that's the only example of where you get a part 2 and a part 3 film back to back. But of course, The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions were both filmed back to back. So they really... I think if any trilogy holds a mirror up structurally to the Back to the Future trilogy, it's maybe that film, or that series of films. But I think Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, his screenwriter, they really approached part 2 and part 3 of their trilogy from a more imaginative perspective than those films did. The Matrix sequels, I always thought would have maybe worked better as one film, whereas part 2 and part 3 of Back to the Future, if you can say anything for them, you can say that despite the fact that they were filmed back to back, and there's often what you get with films that are filmed back to back, you get a consistency, at least with the filmmaking. There seems to be a sort of an aesthetic through line with films that are filmed back to back. You just have to look at Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2 to see that, or the Lord of the Rings films. However, unlike the Matrix films, I think they approach the making of the sequels with far more originality than a lot of filmmakers would, as I mentioned in the last video, dissecting in a way what a sequel is really, and doing something a bit different with part 2, not copying the story beats but creating their own story beats but in the same world, and literally in the latter half of the second film within the same time frame as the first film was happening. And then in the third film, there you really have what was, at least in the 80s, was seen as more of a traditional sequel structure, in that there you got a film that copied the beats of the first film far more closely, but again doing something a bit original with it, whereas the first film was a sort of light-hearted, almost John Hughes-esque teen comedy. It just happened to have a bit of a 1950s nostalgia vibe and this steampunk science fiction aesthetic running through it. The third film, they thought, okay, well, let's take the characters and the beats of the first film and what worked so well in the first film, but let's do something a little bit different. Let's maybe fulfill a bit of a childhood fantasy. So they did a Western. They obviously thought, well, we made a time travel film, but really the first film was just about a time paradox, a sort of Ray Bradbury with laughs sort of story. But in the third film, they really realised, well, we haven't really utilised the other great story possibility idea, which you can do with time travel, which is going to a completely different location, a completely, well, not actually the same location, but a completely different time, a completely different historical setting, and playing with the rules of the world within that time setting. Of course, it was pure good luck on their part that the rules of the time travel that were established in the first film is that you could move in time but not in space. So wherever you time travelled from in the present, you'd get zapped back in exactly the same spot but in a different point in time. So it was pure good luck that the first film happened to be set in Northern California, so that they could then go, well, if we just zapped Doc and then Marty back 100 years into the past, then the film becomes a Western. The Western had really, by 1990, it had died out. It was, as a genre, it was the most popular genre coming out of America. I think something like 1 in 3 films made between the 1930s and the early 1970s was a Western. And this was really down to the fact that they were cheap to make, but they were always a compelling story. There's only really 2 stories you can tell in the Western. One is stranger rides into town and cleans the place up, and then you have the gunslinger getting a group together, a posse together, to go and defeat the antagonists of the film. Although there are allusions made obviously to Clint Eastwood and Sergio Leone and the spaghetti western, which were established in part 2, and even going so far as mirroring the joke from the first film of Marty having a pseudonym. In the first film it's Calvin Klein, because nobody had heard of Calvin Klein in the 1950s. In part 3 it's Clint Eastwood. Of course nobody had heard of Clint Eastwood in the 1880s or the 1950s when the film starts. But really, apart from name checking, this is really lesser a nod to Leone and the revisionist spaghetti western take on the western, and it's really more in the vein of the old school traditional western, the John Ford movie, if you will. It owes much more to John Wayne, I think, than to Clint Eastwood. But like I say, by 1990, the Western had really died out as a genre. I think people had seen through the fact that Hollywood just produced these films because they were easy. They could shoot them all on the back lots. They had the California and the Arizona desert just a few hours away, so it was easy to get film crews out to film these locations that were just meant for widescreen cinema. The desert landscapes and locales of John Ford movies in the Arizona desert, which just looked fantastic on the screen. Come the 1980s, they'd really been replaced, I guess, by blockbuster cinema, by sci-fi, which happened with blockbuster films like Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Alien. It was want-see cinema that was really at the forefront of what people wanted to see. And people wanted to see interesting science fiction movies and time travel movies. So out of that became Back to the Future. And then Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale said, let's see if we can combine the two. Let's take the most interesting genre that the American film industry has ever produced, and it is an interesting genre, the Western. It's one of the few genres that's really not dictated by tone and more by setting. The Western really should have just been a historical subgenre. I can't think of any other sort of specific period in history that spawned its own genre. The theory is that every Western that came out sort of after the 1970s was more a historical drama rather than a strictly speaking, a Western. Probably the last Western to ever come out was really Silverado, which interestingly came out the same year as the original Back to the Future. If they hadn't have taken that step, if they just produced a film that was kind of a beat for beat rehash of the first film, but maybe just done it in a slightly different setting, then I think Back to the Future Part 3 would be a far more lesser work. But I really think that the Western setting, which not everybody likes, and I can see why, some people say it doesn't work for them, the trilogy as a whole, because the third one is too offbeat. It's too out of the box for their liking, and they prefer the sci-fi comedy aesthetic placed in something a lot more domestic, which is what the first two films are. But personally, I think it just elevates the trilogy as a whole into something far richer by making it a Western, because although you are technically copying the story beats of the first film, setting it in a more unlawful time, having a real sense of palpable danger, just by putting Marty and Doc into a time where everybody carries a gun and the West was wild and lawfulness ruled supreme. Hell, just elevating the relatively harmless high school bully to the role of a serial murderer, which is essentially what Buford Tannen, the ancestor of Biff, the bully from the first film. It raises the stakes story-wise, but that doesn't detract from the charm of the trilogy. Still there. The humour of the trilogy is still there. Laugh for laugh, this is a film that I think is just as funny as the first film.
Hey, McFly! Thought I done told you never to come in. Hey, you ain't Seamus McFly. You look like him, though. Especially with that dog ugly hat. You kin to that, hey, barber? What's your name, dude?
Clint Eastwood.
What kind of stupid name is that?
What's that writing mean?
Need K. What is that? Some sort of engine talk or something? Bartender, I'm looking for that no-good cheating blacksmith. You seen him?
No, sir, Mr. Tannen, I have not.
Tannen. You're Mad Dog Tannen.
Mad Dog. I hate that name. I hate it. You hear? Nobody calls me Mad Dog. Especially not some duded up, egg-sucking gutter trash. Dance! Come on! Come on, run! You can dance better than that!
It feels like what the third installment of a movie franchise should feel like. It feels like the make or break story. It feels like, okay, it's the time to wrap up the story, and the stakes are as high as they're ever going to be. The characters might not come out of this unscathed, and that's why I think it really, really works as a film. Back to the Future Part 3, and I do think it's the equal of the first film. The story so far, just to briefly recap, so Doc and Marty, in the last film, they've gone back to the 50s. The reason is they've got to get a book from Biff that gives all the sports results for the next 50 years off him, because he will then use that book to amass a small fortune, or a large fortune in gambling, and essentially take over Hill Valley and become the sort of mini Donald Trump, if you like. They succeed in that task, but right at the end of the film, the DeLorean gets struck by lightning and gets zapped back into the past 70 years. You get this great moment, one of the oddest moments in the whole trilogy, where just after this happens, a car turns up and it's a man from the Western Union, but you don't know who it is at first. He looks like a very sinister character, and he almost looks like he's there to murder Marty at first. But he's there with a letter from the doc saying that he's been living in the past for several months. Marty then goes to see the 1955 version of Doc just after he sent the original Marty back to the future. You still with me? And that's where part 3 begins. They go down a mine where the Doc from the Old West has buried the time machine so that Marty can get himself back home, and he has instructions to destroy the time machine once he gets back because it's caused nothing but ill. But purely coincidentally, while they're there, they discover a grave. It's the grave of Doc, who's died at the hands of Mad Dog Buford Tannen. So Marty decides to follow Doc back into the past to save his life. So you get Marty back in the past. You get all the Western cliches. The first thing he discovers there is a tribe of Native Americans who are being pursued by the cavalry. You get some more great split screen and multi-character work from Michael J. Fox when he meets his great-great-grandfather Seamus, who's just arrived off the boat essentially from Ireland. And something that doesn't really make much sense, but Seamus is married to Leah Thompson, which, considering that Leah Thompson played his mother, doesn't really make any sense, because if it's Seamus McFly, that means he's an ancestor from his paternal line. So why does his great-great-grandmother look like a man that his father will meet many generations later? Maybe they're sort of distant cousins, who knows? That element just doesn't make any sense, but obviously Leah Thompson was an integral part of this franchise by this point, so she winds up in there. I mean, the first two films are really Marty's story. They're with Doc as the side character, but they change it up in this one. Marty almost becomes the side character because this is really Doc's story. The plot in this one is that Doc falls in love with a school teacher played by Mary Steenburgen. So you get this other side to Doc that you get to see. You get to see the Doc fall in love. And ultimately it's Doc who has to make the big decisions in this film. Does he learn to think with his head or with his heart? I think that's really the key to this film and to the franchise as a whole. If Marty's the heart of the films, then and Doc is the brains, the reason they work so well as a sort of character double act is that their emotional arc comes full circle, because this is the film where Doc finally teaches Marty to think with his head, and Marty returns the favour and tells him to think with his heart. And so this leads Doc to making his ultimate decision in the end to follow his heart. Structurally, Back to the Future is pretty much perfect. Every scene in Back to the Future kind of has a counterpart scene, so it's all set up and pay off throughout. Everything that's established pretty much in the first act of the film pays off in the third act of the film, and it's certainly true with part 3 as well. The third part of Back to the Future part 3, the third act of the trilogy, is the strongest, because like in the first film, the stakes are raised. That the story that's set up in the first part of the film really pays off. I think a really strong story structure has to have a couple of elements. It's kind of A plot and B plot that converge at the right time, and all three films have a really edge of the seats denouements, and it's not just because you have 2 or 3 exciting chase sequences at the end of all the films. It's because the stories and the characters and the stakes have been raised so high, and obstacles keep getting thrown in the way. I think this Back to the Future Part 3 has the best example of the stakes being raised and the characters having to overcome it. Obviously the A plot is getting Back to the Future again. It's getting Marty and Doc back to 1985, but at the same time you have the struggle of Doc falling in love and trying to decide if staying in the past is the best thing, and his run-in with Buford Tannen, which is where Marty really plays into the story, because what Marty has to overcome, really, which is set up in part 2 and paid off in part 3, is his hot-headedness. His story's all about how people calling him chicken gets him into trouble. It's alluded to in the future section of part 2 that he broke his hand in a car accident because somebody called him chicken. This supposed race is seen at the end of part 3, but he's overcome it because he decides not to race, and as a consequence he doesn't break his hand and he doesn't screw up his music career and subsequently the rest of his life. The reason he decides that being a hothead and thinking and calming down and not rising to the bait is the best thing is because of his running and his essentially defeating of the bully in the form of Buford Tannen. My favourite scenes, I think, in all the films are the interaction with Michael J. Fox and Thomas F. Wilson. You basically have the big guy, the strong guy, but the dumb guy, and the little guy, but the little guy's got the brains, so he wins every time. And I always think that's the most satisfying story beat you can do in a film. The guy with the brains defeating the guy with the brawn. In the others, you just have these silly little chase sequences. Here in this film, the skateboard scene and the hoverboard scene is kind of reversed. Here it's a lynching scene, but in this film, it's really the one where Marty gets his ass handed to him because he's almost strung up and hung at the start of the film. But his defeating of Buford, his defeating of the bully, really comes towards the end of the film. And as I say, it's the most satisfying. It's probably actually. Well, I've said one other scene's yeah, it is my favourite scene, I think, in all 3 films. Is Marty standing up to Buford. It just works absolutely perfectly in that they reimagine this story beat that they've tried and tested in the other films as a Mexican not a Mexican standoff, but a Western standoff, a standoff in the street. Who's going to draw first? Who's going to fire first? Scene, which is what you think it's going to be, but then of course the film just in time remembers that this is not a violent film. This isn't a Sergio Leone Western. It's not a film where somebody's obviously going to get shot. So Marty uses his brains, and what he does is he remembers a film that Biff was watching in the last film, which happened to be A Fistful of Dollars, in which, of course, famously Clint Eastwood gets gunned down at one point, but it turns out he's wearing a bulletproof vest.
Draw!
No! I thought we could settle this like men.
You thought wrong, dude.
All great stories, I think, have some sort of brush with death at some point. There has to be some point at which you think the main protagonist is going to die. And of course, it turns out that Marty is wearing the front of a boiler. He's tied to him under his Clint Eastwood poncho. And then you get the most satisfying beating up of the bully seen in any film. He takes the bulletproof vest off, whack around the face. He punches him again. into the gravestone that would have been Doc's. So that story element is then essentially over, that Doc's going to live. And then just to tie things up nicely again and hark back to the other films and set the Tannen family on the course that the McFlys are going to put them throughout history, he whacks him one more time, and Buford falls into a big pile of manure, the same way he does in the first film and the second film.
That was good.
It's a great scene. It's a fine wrapping up of the story, and then the tension is lifted essentially for the climax of the film, which is a hell of a lot of fun. Well, it is the car trying to get up to 88 miles an hour again. They're having to push it with a train. The train's coming towards a cliff where the incompleted train track is, and they have to get up to 88 miles an hour before they hit the end of the line. Yeah. I mean, I don't usually do the whole sort of describing the plot and describing the scenes, things in these reviews, because I don't think that's proper movie criticism, just to go through the film and describe the film scene by scenes like some YouTube critics do. However, I'm highlighting the final act of this film just because it's an example of some of the best story writing in cinema and some of the best story structuring in cinema. I mean, there you go, folks. That's just some of my thoughts on why Back to the Future Part 3 works so well for me, and why the trilogy as a whole works so well. I do think it is one of the best movie trilogies ever put on film. It's set over, well, obviously it's set over 130 years, but it's also only set over a couple of days. Back to the Future Part 3 is a perfect ending to the trilogy. It says Part 2 ends with the to be concluded moniker. Part 3 with it categorically saying the end. This is the end of the film. This is the end of this trilogy. This is the end of this story we're going to tell. We're not going to do Part 4 set 100 years into the future, because as Doc says, he's already been there. So there you go, folks. I just wanted to give my thoughts on Back to the Future Part 3, because I know it's not a film that's loved by everyone, but it's a film that's loved by me, and those are the reasons I think it's a great film and a really, really worthy sequel, and one of my favourite films. These ones I just really did for me. This is my birthday week, and I thought I'd look at my favourite films. I'll do something else just for me next year, I'm sure. Until then, folks, thanks for sticking with me. This is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see everyone out there in YouTube land.